Hey everyone, welcome back to How to Research. Today I want to talk to you about the process of applying for a Category 1 grant. Here we're going to talk about the steps that are involved in applying for a Cat 1 grant, how long each of the steps might take, and how you can best prepare yourself in order for it to be as little stress as possible. So first, let's talk about what a Category 1 grant is. This is a term that's used in Australia, so may not apply to those listening in other countries. In Australia, we have national funding bodies such as the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council, who fund large grants to researchers at universities or research institutes. What are these called in your country? I know that there's the NIH grants and the NIHR grants as well. Do you call them Cat 1 grants, or is there another name for them? I have been applying for Cat 1 grants for a few years now, maybe 15 years, and it's only recently that I have a system in place for organising myself to help lower the stress. I've separated the phases of preparing for a Cat 1 grant into different categories. The phases are contemplation, planning, preparing, reviewing, the internal submission, and then finally, hurrah, the external submission. I'm also going to do a video soon on how we can best work with the research office to make sure these grants get in on time. But essentially, I use these categories to help plan my time well in advance to make sure that we get to the finish line in one piece. First, let's talk about the contemplation phase. Really, this is deciding whether or not this grant is worth having a go. Some researchers drag contemplation out and then decide at the last minute that they're going to do it, and then they write it. So I've trained myself as best as possible in order to make that decision early. It's really important then that you can tell your team members and start preparing for the grant well in advance of when it's due. So the contemplation phase usually starts by a granting body releasing a new scheme that would have its own guidelines. In order to make my way through the contemplation phase, I review the guidelines really carefully. I particularly look at the priorities that the call has, as well as the amount of funds that are being allocated, not just for each grant, but across the country. For example, there are some schemes in Australia whereby only 1 or 2 grants will be successful across the entire nation. This gives me an idea of how competitive this scheme will be. And I also look at how long the grant is going to be, whether or not this is going to be worthy of my time to apply for just for a 1-year grant, or whether we are talking about a 5-year grant that might, say, have a higher value attached to it. I also have a think about whether there are projects that I've done in the past that would genuinely put me in a good place to apply for this scheme. If I'm finding that I'm going to need to think about a new project with a new topic that I haven't necessarily had a track record in, then this gives me a prompt that it may not be the right grant for me. We all need to start somewhere, but I do think about what have we done in the past that we might want to write into the grants to give confidence to the reviewers that this is not new for us and we can execute the proposed work really well. In practice, this contemplation phase takes about a month, and that is often me talking to team members, talking to my other colleagues, even family members about, should we give this a go? And if so, what would we propose? And do we have a real chance here? So next, in the planning phase, this is where I start to put pen to paper for a grant. I go back to the guidelines, I have a look at the external date, write it down, the internal date, I write it down, as well as the minimum data date. That's applicable to some schemes where you essentially give the funding body a heads up that your grant is coming. This is the title, this is the general research area, and that helps the funding body start to look for reviewers for when the grant comes in. Also in the planning phase, I start to think about what's the general aim of the project or the program of work that we're proposing, what's the general method, even in a few sentences, and what do we hope to achieve by the end? Really, what I hope to make clear is what is the point in someone investing money in this work to have it done? So what would the benefit or the impact be to society or to a population group if this work is done? What I find really helpful in this phase is working with someone in the team who can really sense check whether what I'm writing down with these early ideas is resonating with them. Is it understandable? Does the aim actually make sense? Does the method align with the aim? And do we really think that we can bring about the benefit that we're proposing from this work? All of this might just be written down in a one-page summary, but it's, again, the sharing between team members helps me to really formalize that idea and give me confidence to move on to the preparation phase. Just before I talk about preparation, so this planning phase takes about 2 weeks, and it's really just going back and forth with team members, as well as putting dates in the calendar and sending the notification to the research office that we're going to apply. So next is the preparation phase, and this is probably the longest. If we're in a rush, maybe it's a month, but if we have plenty of notice, it could have even be 2 or 3 months. And this is where I start to allocate some tasks to some other people in order to get this grant fleshed out. In our team, I'm very fortunate that we have some people who love doing budgets, some people who love writing methods, and some people who love the overall grant's craftsmanship of the opening sections of a grant. So we work together as a team and discuss who will write which sections, what the general length of those sections would be, the general content of those sections, and when we want to have drafts due for one another to check. I've learned over the past few years that visual depictions of what you're trying to say count a lot. So we have someone in our team who really focuses on the figures that are going to be throughout the grant. Some grants can be 6, 9, 12 pages long, and there might be 3, 4, 5 figures in there. So they need to be consistent in their tone. They need to be vibrant enough to not only stand out to a reviewer that what you're conveying has been put together well in a figure, but it also helps set you apart from the other pile of applications that the reviewers will be looking at that day. I find that in some ways this part does get easier over time. Sometimes we might be recycling an unsuccessful grant from a previous round, which means we might be starting with several pages of content that we can refine. I still find this section quite challenging. We still need to take a fresh lens as to why this work is the best match for this scheme with the priorities that are listed in the scheme. So this is definitely the toughest section of applying for a grant. At the end of the day, I have found that this section runs really well when you have a close-knit team who are communicating well with one another and lending one another a support. That might be just reviewing a few sentences that someone has written to make sure it makes sense, or checking over a few pages at a time. But we really need all people on the team on deck in order for the grant to be progressing well. Next up is the reviewing and the internal submission. With a grant, there may be 10 or more listed investigators, and it's possible that not all of them have been with you since the start of applying for that grant. So this is a fantastic opportunity to show a near fully drafted grant to some of the investigator team for a fresh review. You might also share your draft proposal with other people, say in your school or your centre or wherever you're situated in your workplace, to get fresh eyes. When I've looked back on some of the successful grants I've had, sometimes it'll be literally 10, 12, 15 people who I've asked to review a grant, even just peruse briefly, say for 5 or 10 minutes, to ask them what do they think about when they see this piece of work, or to peruse over the proposal and just share any early thoughts. Often at this time, it's also when we'll be putting together CVs or publication lists or other information that relates to track record that can seem quite trivial and administrative, but at the end of the day is very important to show consistency in diligence with formatting so that the whole grant comes across to a reviewer that it is highly professional. It's been refined and reviewed. So some tips in this section might be making sure that each person's CV has the same headings throughout or has been formatted in the same way. Perhaps if you have photos involved that are the same size, all of that really helps to show a reviewer that you're a professional team who have taken care when preparing this grant proposal. From a timing perspective, I would usually leave about 3 or 4 weeks for this reviewing category. And that's because some people in your team might be on leave or might take a long time to get back to you, particularly if they need to share information, CVs, or you need to reformat some information. So it can be a little longer than first anticipated. So next, it's time to send your grant off to the research office. Depending on where you work, there might be some steps involved in this. It could be certifying the application in a portal that automatically goes to the research office, or it might be attaching it to an email. You might have a grant cover sheet that you need to complete, where you may, for example, need your line manager or head of school or institute's signature to approve that they support the work. And there's nothing worse than wanting to get a grant off your desk and realizing, oh, drats, I haven't completed the cover sheet, or I haven't done one of the steps that's going to be required in order to get this internally submitted. So preparing for that will be important. A tip that I found helpful in our team is putting a calendar entry for our team on the day that we're hoping to do the internal submission, and even just noting down what the steps are so that we're all really on the same page about where we are now and where we want to be on the day that we submit internally. Because to me, that's the first celebration that your grant is complete. Depending on where you are in the queue for the research office, and this is why I'll do a video on working with the research office, depending on where you are in the queue will dictate how long it takes for the research office to get back to you. If you are high up in the queue, that means that you were one of the first to submit to the scheme. You will get feedback quickly. So this could, say, be anywhere from 1 to 5 days. And usually the research office will give you a long list of eligibility checks that they've done on your behalf. So things like making sure that your CV match the requirements of the guidelines, that even your proposal page margins are what's permitted for the grant scheme. They might give you some suggestions about different sections of your proposal or other aspects of your grant and the adequacy with which you've met or answered the question. They might know a little bit about your work and give you some tips about, hey, why don't you include this or why don't you include that? Something else that they will look at for any investigators that have had career breaks or interruptions that need to be noted down, they'll do a check as to whether it's been verified and so that they have evidence of that, and whether it's been formatted appropriately for the reviewers. I found that the last few grants that I've submitted, there's usually 2 or 3 tic-tacs back between ourselves and research office, whereby we might respond to some feedback, recertify in the system, wait a few more days, respond to some more feedback. So we might go back and forth 2 to 3 times before the research office checks in and says, we think it's ready. With your permission, we will queue this for external submission. And that takes me to the final stage, the external submission. You don't want to be submitting your grants close to the hour or the minute in which submissions close. So the research office will queue the submission, say half a day or 1 day before the external submission closes. This might differ based on the organisation that you work for, and I'd be keen to know what's the standard where you are. But for us, it means that we know that our grant will get safely to the funding body in on time. And that's when we really celebrate. It's a big piece of work off our desk, and we start to cross our fingers and play the waiting game, waiting for the outcome several months down the line. So there you have it. That is how to put together a Cat 1 grant. As you can see, you don't underestimate the time that it will take. Really, some of these are 6 to 12 months in the making. Let's remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So the best thing you can do is to be organised, work closely with your team, and enjoy the process along the way, of both in terms of learning and also working with your close colleagues. And finally, there's a couple of other videos that I'm going to link to. What do you do when you get that grant that you've applied for? But also, what do you do if you've missed out on that grant, and the best way to manage rejection? But for now, celebrate putting your grant together. I hope you found this useful.